So thank you all for joining us again at CCSC 2022. My name is Aiden and I'm a part of CSSA's internal group. I'm excited to introduce our next and final speaker, Dr. Stephen Luck. Dr. Luck is a distinguished professor of psychology at UC Davis and has served as the director of the UC Davis Center for Mind and Brain since 2009. His research focuses on the neural mechanisms of attention and working memory, and he's also developed leading theories of cognitive dysfunction in subjects with neurological disorders such as schizophrenia. His presentation today is titled Visual Working Memory and the Computer Metaphor for the Human Mind. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Dr. Stephen Luck.
Thank you for the introduction. I've got to get the microphone set here. Just give me 1 second. We can make this go away. Well, maybe not. Isn't technology great when it works? Well, it's really a pleasure to be here. I always love leaving the Davis bubble and driving along I-80 to come here to the People's Republic of Berkeley and to visit the mothership of the greatest university system in the world, the University of California system. And it's a particular pleasure to come talk to an undergraduate group of cognitive scientists. I wish that when I was an undergrad, cognitive science had existed as a major and I could have taken it. And I had that desire for so long that about 7 years ago, I worked with a philosopher and a linguist at UC Davis to create a cognitive science major at UC Davis. And that major, when we first thought about it, we thought, well, if we could get 100 students to major in cognitive science, we will consider this to be a success. Well, we've got something like 650 students majoring in cognitive science now. And this program became so successful that when we hired a new chancellor, the chancellor wanted me to come explain to him what the heck cognitive science is. And that's a hard thing to do. He's a smart guy, but he's an engineer, right? He's not a neuroscientist. He's not a psychologist. He's not a so I created this slide, which is a kind of oversimplification, but I think captures the essence of cognitive science. So cognitive science, in my view, is the interdisciplinary study of knowledge systems. So of course we put cognitive science in the middle. Let's see, I should use my mouse pointer so that people on Zoom can see it. So cognitive science is in the middle, and we can have all these other disciplines that contribute to it. And there are others, but these are sort of the 5 major disciplines that contribute to cognitive science. So philosophy asks how knowledge is possible. Psychology asks how people and other animals know things. Neuroscience asks how the brain knows things. Computer science asks how machines can know things. And linguistics asks how knowledge is communicated. So I used this to explain it to him, and it seemed to work. He didn't kill our major or anything like that, and so we're still going strong. But I decided that today I would use this as a way of kind of structuring my talk and describing kind of, the overall big picture of it. And I'm going to be talking today about the nature of working memory. And unlike the other talks that I've seen so far, I'm not going to use the C word, the consciousness word. I like to say that my research is consciousness adjacent. And as you'll see, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is very similar to the global workspace theory of consciousness, except I'm not going to try to say anything about consciousness because I'm either not smart enough or too smart, one or the other. I'm not quite sure which. Okay, so we're going to start with a little philosophical perspective. That's very interesting. What happened to? I'm going to just try restarting PowerPoint and see if it likes that better. Okay, so we'll start with talking about this classical philosophical issue of using the computer as a metaphor for the mind. And I'll talk about that in the specific case of working memory. And then I'll talk about a psychological perspective where we empirically measure some properties of the human visual working memory system. And I'm a vision guy, right? I go to the vision sciences meeting every year. So I'm a cognitive scientist and a neuroscientist and a vision scientist. So I'll be talking about visual working memory, which by constraining ourselves to vision gives us all kinds of tools and anatomy and physiology. So there are a lot of advantages to talking about visual working memory. And then I'll get into some computer science and talk about how we can use the von Neumann computer architecture to get some insights into the nature of human visual working memory. And then I'll digress a little bit to talk about the neural mechanisms of working memory storage. And all of this I will bring together to try to answer the question of what is the computational function of the human working memory system. And for those of you interested in linguistics, sorry, I'm not going to talk about linguistics at all, but it wouldn't take a lot of imagination for you to figure out how you could take these same ideas and put them into a linguistic context. I could try to do that, but then you would see how ignorant I am about linguistics. Okay, so on to the computer metaphor for the mind. Well, we can talk about the computer metaphor for working memory. And this is something that is regularly taught. It's in many textbooks. Here's an example in the classic textbook from Ed Smith and Stephen Coslin, where they say that the information stored in the hard disk of a conventional computer is like long-term memory, and RAM corresponds to working memory. So the metaphor, or really simile here, is that working memory is like RAM in a conventional digital computer. Now, if you start talking about using a computer as a metaphor for the human mind in general, or parts of the human mind, you quickly run into people saying that the brain is not like a computer. This is a bad metaphor. So this is just one random blog post. I like the graphic, that's why I'm showing it. I haven't actually read the blog post, but there are hundreds just like it. And since I'm here at Berkeley, you have to raise John Searle's Chinese room. Like that's a classic idea about how, the nature of the hardware matters. It's not computation in general. So a lot of people think, no, it's just dumb to think of the mind or the brain as being in any way analogous to a computer. But there are other people like Gary Marcus who wrote this New York Times opinion piece that says, face it, your brain is a computer. And I'm not going to try to convince you whether or not the brain is a computer, because that's really just like, how are we going to define computer? But what I am hopefully going to show you is that it can be useful practically as a research tool to think about these analogies. So we're going to look at the question of whether, well, is RAM a good analogy for working memory? And in fact, I'm going to show you that RAM is a terrible analogy for working memory. But if we really think more deeply about the nature of computers, and especially the von Neumann computer architecture, which is the architecture of my MacBook here and every other computer you've probably ever used, that actually there are some insights that we can draw. Okay. Little tiny bit of sort of philosophical stuff there. Now I'm going to talk about something I'm more comfortable with, which is the empirically measured properties of visual working memory. And if you want a sort of summary of this field, here's a very short paper that my former grad student Ed Vogel and I wrote a few years ago in Trends in Cognitive Sciences. And one of the main things that we and others have found over the years that is just often treated as a fundamental fact about the human mind is that visual working memory and working memory in general is sort of this temporary storage buffer. And in vision, it has a very small capacity. So you might have heard, oh, working memory stores 7 plus or minus 2 items. That's an old idea from George Miller from the 1950s. And at least in vision, it's more like 3 to 4 objects. That's probably true outside of vision as well. Okay, but what does this really mean, and to have such a limited storage capacity? So let me give you an example. Some of you may have seen this before. This has been around for a very long time. Might have seen this. And so this is an example of what's called change blindness, where because of the limited storage capacity of your visual working memory system, you're going to have a hard time detecting a difference between two natural scenes. So here's a scene. Here's the same scene, but something has changed. Did anybody detect what changed? Okay, I'm going to go back and forth. Okay, what's different about, it's a pretty major thing. Anybody detected it yet? Okay, don't say it, don't say it. Okay, so let's keep going. Okay, so more and more people are getting it, and some of you are like, they're the same. So it's a functionally important part of the jet. If you didn't have this, you wouldn't go anywhere. Okay, so hopefully you can see the engine of the jet. Okay, so when you look at this scene, you have this experience of a detailed representation of the entire scene. But the moment we take it away, most of it goes away. So you have very little information that persists beyond a couple hundred milliseconds after the offset of a visual stimulus. Okay, so there was some research in the 1990s that used that approach with real scenes and made a big splash. And it's cool, but it's hard to like get into details of what's going on with these complex scenes that are hard to control, et cetera. So at the same time that people like Dan Simons were doing research with scenes like that, my lab, which has a much simpler approach to things, developed a different way of looking at visual working memory capacity that ends up being a lot easier to control and to quantify. So I'm going to show you an example of the task that we came up with, which you call a change detection task, in which you're going to see two colored squares briefly. I'm going to take them away, then they're going to come back, and one of the items will have changed colors. And I want you to just like note to yourself, can you tell which item changed colors? And by the way, the brief presentation that we're using here simulates what is coming into your visual system all the time, because you make about 3 or 4 eye movements per second. So you really only have about a quarter of a second to store information in working memory in natural vision with eye movements. So this brief presentation isn't just some weird laboratory thing. It really does simulate an important part of natural vision. Okay, so here are 2 squares. How many of you detected which item changed? Anybody miss it? Okay, if you missed it, you probably just weren't paying attention at the moment that I started it. So I'll go back. Okay, so that's easy. Okay, we're now going to make this a little harder. There are going to be 4 colored squares. I want you to determine, can you detect a change between the first set that I show and the second set? Okay, here we go. How many detected it? Okay, very good. Now, the average big state university college student is only about 80% correct with 4 items. As I will show you later, performance on this task is impressively correlated with IQ. Of course, the cognitive science students in the UC system are gonna like do really well. But still, you have your limits. So now let's do the same thing, but there will be 12 items. Let's see if you can detect the change. Here we go. Okay, a few people got it. Very impressive. Now, are you sure you got it? Because what I find is that about 3/4 of the people who think they saw a change, if I ask them which item changed, they point to the wrong one. But I'm just going to go back and forth so that everybody can see. Okay, if you haven't gotten it yet, it's near the top. Okay, now most of you failed to get this, and like 95% of people fail on this. And I want to point out here that these are the simplest objects that you can imagine. And when it changed, right, it changed from orange to blue, right? That's a big change. And yet, despite the simplicity of this display and the fact that it's an enormous change, people have a hard time detecting it because your working memory capacity is so limited. Okay, let me show you another example. We're going to do 12 items again. This time you will get it right, and I won't even have to tell you why. You'll immediately know why. Okay, so attention has an enormous impact on what gets encoded into working memory. In fact, I first got interested in studying visual working memory because I had done a lot of research in graduate school on attention, and it was clear that one of the main things that attention was responsible for is determining what information gets into working memory. Because working memory capacity is so limited, you need to be very strategic about what gets stored in working memory. Okay, so there's Ed Vogel, who once upon a time was a graduate student working in my lab. He's now a full professor at the University of Chicago. And he and I cooked up this task. So here's how it works in the laboratory. We have this initial array that we call the sample array, on for about 1/10 of a second. Duration doesn't matter that long. 1/10 of a second, whole second, get about the same thing. Then there's a delay, and as long as it's longer than about 100 milliseconds, it doesn't really matter too much. Anywhere between about 100 milliseconds and 5 seconds, you get about the same results. Less than 100 milliseconds, you can use your iconic memory, but once you get to a delay of 100 milliseconds or more, iconic memory doesn't help you out here. So then you get this test array, and typically we do it where it's change detection, where there either is a change or there isn't, and subjects press one button if they detect the change, another button if they don't. If there is a change, it's a very big, obvious change in color. So if you do this task, you can vary the number of items in the array. And imagine that you have a capacity of 4 items. You can hold 4 items in working memory. Well, if I give you 1 item, 2 items, 3 items, 4 items, you should be perfect at doing this task. You stored all the items in working memory, you should be able to detect the change. But if I give you 5 items, you'll only store 4 out of the 5 items. So there's a 1 out of 5 chance that the item that changes is not one of the items that you're holding in working memory. And so then you might make an error. And you have to take into account guessing, but there's a fairly easy set of mathematical formulas for this. So what you'd expect if you looked at just percent correct on this task is if you've got a capacity of 4, you're perfect at set sizes. That's the number of items in the display. Perfect at set sizes up to 4, and then it should fall off systematically because you have fewer and fewer, or lower and lower probability of having the changed item in your working memory. Now, if you do this empirically, you get something like this. And these data come from students at the University of Iowa. Their storage capacity is lower than that at UC Davis. I don't know that anybody has ever tested it here at Berkeley. We should have a competition. So set size is 1 or 2. Like every now and then there's an error because somebody sneezed or they weren't looking at the screen at the right time. Some people consistently make errors at set size 3. Other people like hardly ever make an error at set size 3. Most people make at least occasional errors at set size 4, and then it goes down from there. So we can mathematically convert this into an estimate of how many items the subject actually had in working memory. And we call that K. And so if you give the subject 1 item, they're nearly perfect. So they store 1 item in memory. Give them 2, they store 2. Give them 3, well, on average, across a bunch of people, only 2 3/4 items have been stored. Get up to 4 items, well, a little over 3, and then it plateaus. They don't get any higher than that. Okay, so that's sort of basic data, and this has been replicated about 1 million times. I want to point out that this is not verbal storage. You could try to name the colors, but the naming is actually slower and it just makes life more difficult for you. So it doesn't really help to try to name them. Okay, now the way I've been describing this so far is you store, say, 4 items in working memory and you'll know nothing about the other items. And that is one possible theory of how working memory works. That you see a display with many items, and if you have a capacity of 3, or even if you have an average capacity of 3.5, maybe sometimes you store 3 items, sometimes you store 4. On average, you're storing 3.5. But you know the colors of 3 of the items, and the other items, like you might know that there was something there, but you know nothing about the color. We call that the slot model. It's like you've got a certain number of memory slots. You put 1 color in each slot. Once you run out of slots, you don't store the information, just gets thrown in the trash bin. So that's a simple model. Another model is called the resource model. And the idea here is you've got some kind of mental processing resource, some kind of brain juice. You've got a limited amount of it. If you only have to remember one item, you can put all of your brain juice into that one item, get a really great representation. And as we have more and more items that you're remembering, you're distributing that brain juice across more and more items, less juice per item. And so you end up with kind of a fuzzy representation of each item. And sometimes that representation might be good enough to detect a change. Sometimes it might not. There's some randomness in it. And this theory can also, at least qualitatively, explain the data that I've shown you so far. So about 15 years ago, a grad student in my lab, Wee Zhang, who's now an associate professor of psychology at UC Riverside, he and I did some experiments to try to distinguish between these theories. And you can read those experiments if you want in this paper that we published in Nature. What seems like yesterday, but most of you were still entering your teenage years at that point or something like that. And we found what we believe was definitive evidence for the slot model. And this unleashed a torrent of research, and there were just paper after paper after paper going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And what I would say is if anybody tells you they know the answer to this question, they are either deceiving you or they are deceiving themselves. And the answer is probably none of the above, and it's more complicated than just one of these two options. And in a year, I hope to have a much better answer where it's not just, it could be one of those. We're working on a much better model of this, but it's not quite ready for prime time yet. I'm hoping we'll have all the data collected by about June. But what I want to get to instead is a question of, well, why should we care about working memory capacity for little colored squares? Like, who cares? Like, when I had to tell my parents what I was working on, they're like, what? So here's why you might want to care. So there's this assumption that's been around in cognitive psychology since the 1960s, which is that your ability to maintain multiple simultaneous representations is important for a variety of higher level cognitive tasks. Let me give you an example. So this is a task called Raven's progressive matrices. And it's often used as one of several measures of fluid intelligence. So you see this matrix and you go, okay, you got this pattern, this pattern, this pattern, and this where you got this pattern, this pattern, this pattern, this, like what would go here that would match this set of other items? So there's a sort of systematic change. So you go from here to here to here, here to here to here. If you went here to here to here, following that same pattern, what would you get? Anybody can guess what the right answer is? Just somebody yell it out. The lower right. Okay. So obviously very high IQ audience here. Now to do that, you have to maintain information about like this one and this one and this. You have to maintain a lot of information and integrate it all together. So theoretically, being able to store more information in working memory is going to make you better able to do tasks like this and allow you to score higher on IQ tests, which of course is not the same thing as being more intelligent. It just means being better at stupid tests like this. But is that assumption actually borne out by the data? So this has been tested by various people, but I did a study with my longtime collaborator, Jim Gold, where we measured the working memory storage capacity. It was not the change detection task, it was change localization. There was always a change, you just had to click on the item that changed. Same basic idea. And we measured in these individuals their overall cognitive ability using something called the matrix battery. And this is a bunch of individual cognitive tests for like problem solving and reasoning and processing speed and all those things. And you combine them all together and you get a measure of overall cognitive ability. And I don't know if you need to do the statistical analysis here to see this, but there is a relationship, right? The higher your working memory capacity is, the better you do on this battery of cognitive tests. And that's a pretty impressive correlation for a 10-minute test of working memory capacity. And we also measured in these people the Wechsler Adult Scale of Intelligence, a standard IQ test, and we got a pretty strong correlation there as well. So even though we're looking at these little colored squares, it does seem to be at least correlated with higher cognitive abilities. Now, another thing that we've been looking at for over 20 years now is differences in various cognitive functions, but especially working memory and attention between people with schizophrenia and demographically matched healthy control subjects. And if you do that, you see this pattern. So here are the working memory capacity values here, and the bars indicate how many people in each group or what percentage of the people have that capacity. So if you look at the control subjects, well, they have an average of 2.93. These are like real people out in the world, variety of ages, education, et cetera. So their capacity is lower than what you get for a bunch of high-performing college students, where here at Berkeley, it may be 3.4. 3.5 at UC Davis. You look at the patients and it's 2.34. And you're like, well, is that a big difference? Well, look at this. Like there are very few people with schizophrenia with memory capacities up at 3 or 3.5, but quite a few control subjects. Down here, a lot of schizophrenia patients down very low. Very few healthy people down that low. This is a very large difference by the standard of neuropsychological tests. So it's an effect size of 1.15 standard deviations. That's a big effect. Okay, so now you have a sense of what I mean by visual working memory. So let's get back to this computer metaphor. So is this visual working memory with a capacity of 3 to 4 objects, lower in people with schizophrenia, higher in people with higher IQs, is that really like the RAM inside of my MacBook Pro? My MacBook Pro, here are the specs, it's got 32 gigabytes of RAM, as opposed to about 3 colors that I can store in working memory. So it's a bad analogy. And I used to teach an Intro to Cognitive Psychology course, and I'd be giving this analogy because it's sort of the standard thing, and I'd be giving it going, I am lying to the students, I am lying to the students. And finally, I decided I had to stop lying to the students and rethink this analogy. So to rethink this, I went back to kind of principles of computation and thinking about, well, why do we need a working memory system at all? So this is where it gets like the global workspace theory of consciousness, except I don't know if any of this is conscious. I have no way of measuring it. I think a lot of it isn't, and I'm not going to answer that question. I'm going to try to answer this question instead, which is why do we need a working memory system, whether we're aware of it or not? Okay, so people talk about working memory as being like a blackboard. You can do all kinds of things on a blackboard. Let me give you a much more concrete example. So do this equation in your head. 2 plus 7 plus 6 equals, what's the answer? 15. Okay, who wants to tell everybody how you got to that answer? Somebody raise your hand. Yes.
So I started with 7 plus 2, which got me 9. And then I did 9 plus 6, and I carried the 1 over the 6 to get 10, and then I was with 5, so that got me.
Awesome, great. Except you probably didn't have to do the whole carry the 1 thing. You probably have memorized that 9 plus 6 is 15. How many other people, when you were doing this, had to use the number 9? Anybody solve this problem without having to think of the number 9? Okay, so there might be some other strategies, but this is kind of the standard way to do it. You're going to add 2 of the number, like I guess you could add the 2 and the 6 together and get 8 and add the 7 to that, right? So you've got this like intermediate result. Where is it? It's not in the physical world, it's in your head. So if you solve it like this, 2 plus 7 equals 9, 9 plus 6 equals 15, you had to have a representation of 9. Where is that representation? Working memory. That's the idea, that you need a temporary buffer in order to do a variety of cognitive tasks. And the key here is that this does not look like a memory storage and retrieval task, right? When you look at this, you don't go, oh, obviously you need to store the number 9 in memory, right? Working memory is not there to solve memory tasks. It's there to help you solve other tasks. So the classic idea is, oh, you use it when you have to remember a phone number. Like, who has to do that anyway? Like, that's not what working memory is for. It's for things like this, for storing intermediate results. Okay, what about visual working memory? What do we need a visual working memory for? Well, here's one thing that we need it for. You're trying to compare two things that you can't see well at the same time. So this is just an example from my book on the ERP technique, and it's an example of how not to plot ERPs. Because if you want to ask, how is this waveform different from this one? It's hard to tell because you have to like look at this one, store it in working memory, now compare down here your working memory of that one to what you're seeing here. Because it's hard to compare them when they're distant from each other. So you can tell that this is smaller than this, but you're really using your working memory to do that. And you really need to just overlay the waveforms one on top of the other, and then it's much easier to do. Okay, so comparing objects across eye movements requires a working memory system. Here's another thing that's like doesn't seem like a memory task that seems to, well, we have lots of evidence that it requires working memory. Mental rotation. So we've got this little symbol there. So I'm going to show you two different versions of it. You need to tell me which one could be rotated to match the one you're seeing up here. So is it the one on the left or the one on the right? So left one or right one? It's the one on the right. Now, there are different ways that you can solve this problem, but one way that you very commonly do solve it is to mentally rotate this representation to upright and then match it against these two. Where is the representation that's being rotated? It's in working memory. Okay, so you may need a temporary storage buffer even for tasks with no obvious memory requirements. So that gets us to computational issues and the von Neumann computer architecture. I had to learn a lot about this when I was an undergrad because I was doing a bunch of computer programming in machine language because that's what we could do at the time, because it was easier than piling the rocks on top, the other things that we could do in the Stone Ages. So I thought about that von Neumann computer architecture, and I realized that it has something in it that's very much like a temporary storage buffer that you're using for things that aren't obviously memory tasks. So here's the von Neumann computer architecture. So if you got your CPU up here and you have your peripheral devices here, here's that RAM that's not like working memory because it's 32 gigabytes. You got your hard drive, video card, audio card, keyboard, all of your peripheral devices, and they all connect through a bus to the CPU. And the CPU has the part of it that you think about, the part that can add numbers and compare things, the arithmetic and logic unit, but it also has a set of registers, maybe a dozen registers in it, some of which are used for code information and some of which are used for data. And the system that I was doing the machine language programming in when I was in college had 3 registers in it. 3. Have we heard that number today? Okay, and so the idea is whenever you're going to do something, do some computations in a von Neumann computer, you take information from RAM or hard drive or keyboard or whatever, you put the information into the registers, and the arithmetic and logic unit reads from the registers and writes the results to the registers. Okay, so everything in many versions of a von Neumann computer goes through the registers. Okay, so if you're going to add 2 numbers together, you put them in the registers, you add them, then the result goes into another register. And then maybe you're going to put it in RAM or on the hard drive, or maybe not, depending on what you're going to do. Okay, so it's these registers that are like working memory. So our modified analogy is that working memory isn't like RAM. It's like the CPU registers. It's a small number of slots that this information gets stored in order to operate on it. Not to remember it, but to operate on it. The idea is in order to do cognitive operations on information, that information has to be in working memory. Now, in a computer, working memory is a place. In the brain, it's probably a state. Now, a more specific version of this hypothesis is that information must be stored in working memory to be available for non-automated cognitive operations. If everything that your brain did had to go through working memory, like how would you breathe and do math problems at the same time, right? So things that are automated can probably happen without working memory. There's a lot of stuff in your computer that can be done without using the CPU at all. Because if everything had to go through the CPU, then it becomes a bottleneck and that becomes inefficient. Okay, let me give you a demonstration now of what I mean by non-automated cognitive operations. So imagine you're in my lab and you've got a computer screen and I tell you, okay, here's the task you're going to do today. I would do this with buttons in my lab, but we're going to just do this audio participation. I want you to clap once if I show you the letter A, and don't clap if I show you the letter B. Okay, everybody ready? Here we go. Okay, very good. Let's do it again. Okay, let's do it again. How about again? Ooh, very good. Okay. Excellent job. You are either conscious or philosophical zombies, and I can't tell the difference from your performance there. Okay, so our specific hypothesis is doing even that simple task required you to store that letter, whether it was an A or a B, whatever you saw on a given trial, that had to be stored in working memory to do that task, because that was not an automated task, especially the first time you did it. Has anybody ever before asked you, clap once if you see the letter A, but not if you see the letter B? No, so that's not automated, and you did not have enough trials of practice for it to become automated. Okay, so even in this simple task, you have to store that letter in working memory in order to link it with the response that was required by the task, just as you put stuff into a CPU in a computer in order to compute things. So if I wrote a computer program to do this task, it'd be like, if the keyboard equals A, then play sound clapping, right? So when you do this, if keyboard equals A, well, that's going to cause information from the keyboard to get stored in the registers, whatever letter the subject pressed, A, B, whatever, gets stored in a register. And then the program is going to cause the letter A, or the ASCII code for the letter A. And then your CPU is going to ask whether those two are the same or different. And then the output will get saved to a register, and then ultimately it's going to play this clapping sound. Okay, so that's the analogy here. And this is a specific case of what I like to call the second most important unsolved problem in cognitive science, which is the problem of cognitive flexibility. So here's a real world example of this task. You're at a friend's house. Your friend has a fantastic kitchen. You're at your friend's parents' house. And your friend says, could you go into the kitchen and tell me if there's a bowl of fruit under the microwave? So you go into the kitchen, you look under the microwave, you see, oh, there's a bowl of fruit. You go back out and you say, yes, there's a bowl of fruit. Okay, you've never done that specific task before, and yet you can do it with no practice. Okay, so that's the real world, but who cares about that? Let's talk about laboratory tests. So let's do a demonstration of this. So we're going to change the task we used before just slightly. Now you're going to clap if you see an A or a B, but not for a C or a D, and ignore the color of the letters. Okay, so clap for A or B, not for C or D. Ready? Here we go. Okay, very good. Oh, very good. I thought I would get at least one error. Okay, here we go. Good. Good, very good. Okay, so now we're going to change the task. Now I want you to clap if the letter is red and not if it's blue, and ignore the shape. Okay, here we go. Okay, excellent. Very good. Very good. You know, I was worried that this demonstration wouldn't work. No, come on, because like this seems trivial, right? But like at one moment in time, with no practice, I asked you to do this thing. And now notice here, the letter B, you clapped in the first task, and C, you didn't clap. Then I just gave you a new instruction verbally, no practice. And now you're clapping for C and not for B, right? You've rerouted the information. In the first task, you saw the letter B, you clapped. Moments later, because I changed the instruction, you saw the letter B, you didn't clap. We're changing the routing of information between your sensory system and your motor system on the basis of a single instruction with no practice. Okay, now, like, yeah, obviously you can do stuff like that. You do things like that all the time. Why is this a difficult problem? Well, think about the way the brain is organized. The traditional way of thinking about the brain is that it's a network of neurons connected by synapses. So you can think of a real brain or a neural network. And the pattern of synaptic weights determines the flow of information through that system, like how a particular input pattern leads to a particular output pattern. Now, here's the important thing. Traditionally, we think of those weights, the synaptic efficacy, as changing relatively slowly as you learn on the basis of experience, right? Like Hebbian learning, right? Changes slowly on the basis of experience. So how can we actually reroute the flow of information through this system just by giving somebody a verbal instruction with no practice? Some evil genius is playing a trick on me. So this is a difficult problem. Like, how could this possibly work? It's a difficult problem, but it's not the hard problem. So this is a problem that I'm talking about, this rerouting. It's like you can kind of imagine how with current scientific practices, we will ultimately solve that problem, as opposed to the hard problem, which, like, yeah, it's not that I think it can't be solved, but it's not easy to think how we're ever going to solve the hard problem. But so it's just difficult. Okay, so this leads us to the next part of the talk, where we'll talk just a little bit about neural mechanisms of working memory storage. So the basic idea from systems neuroscience and computational neuroscience is that working memory is achieved by recurrent feedback. So you have a neuron here that fires, and it's connected to this neuron. So then this one fires, and then it sends an input back to this one and causes this one to fire. And you get the ball rolling, and it just keeps going. So you can maintain neural activity over a period of time. So that's the standard idea of how you can retain something in working memory. You haven't changed any neural weights here, right? You just have this feedback loop that keeps the representation going through neural activity. And we can contrast this with long-term memory, which we think about as arising sort of through changes in synaptic strength, by changes in the number of neurotransmitter molecules that are released, or changes in the number of receptors or the efficacy of the receptors. There are a variety of changes. But once those changes have happened, they're just sitting there. It's sort of passive storage. Once you've made the change, it doesn't require any action potentials or postsynaptic potentials to maintain those changes in synaptic strength. So if you're going to do what I do and put electrodes on somebody's head, you can't see this activity. It's just sitting there in the brain. Like, all the memories that are in your brain are just kind of sitting there in the pattern of synaptic strengths. But this working memory, this recurrent feedback, leads to voltages that we can actually record from the surface of the scalp. Okay, so let's take this back to the von Neumann computer architecture. So we've got our working memory by recurrent feedback, and the claim here is that this is like the registers inside of a CPU. And we've got our long-term memory, which is like the hard drive, which is these synaptic weights. But what about RAM? Is there an analogy to RAM? Well, the analogy to RAM is something that gets called activated long-term memory. So you have something that you paid attention to, and now you're paying attention to something else. You're no longer storing a working memory, but like you just had that active, 5 seconds ago. There's still some decaying activation of that long-term memory. It's no longer in working memory. It's an activation of the long-term memory that just fades gradually over time. And the ability of us to do this, to have this sort of, you activate your long-term memory when you're thinking about something, maybe because of working memory storage, and then you shift your attention, your working memory to something else, and that stuff in long-term memory kind of fades back down to the background level over a period of maybe a minute or two. And that's a way of giving us access to more recent information than we can store in our very limited working memory, which can only store about 3 or 4 items. So this gives us this intermediate stuff of things that were recently available. So let me give you an example of this. So I went to college in Portland, Oregon in a previous millennium in the 1980s. Okay. Oh, sorry. How much time do I have left? 40 minutes? When they told me that this talk went from 3 o'clock until 4:30, I thought, well, that includes Q&A and all, and nobody wants me to talk for an hour and a half. So I'm going to view that as I've got about 10 or 12 minutes left. Okay. Anyway, the whole point of that was just to distract you so you no longer held in your working memory the information about where and when I went to college. So that was just a ruse. I knew I've got a clock right here. I knew how much time I had left. Okay, so where did I go to college? When did I go to college? Right. There's no way that you retain that information actively in working memory. You can only hold like 3 little bits of information in working memory, and you got distracted, and you probably started looking at your cell phone, and right? But that information is still active because it was activated, several seconds before. Okay. So this is what I mean by activated long-term memory, stuff that was recently in long-term memory, and now it's just kind of, it was sort of boosted up, and now it's fading down. And you didn't have to create new representations in long-term memory. You just had to have like, okay, Portland, Oregon is active in my memory. 1980 is active in my memory. Those are the answers to the question. Okay, and there's a hypothetical mechanism, although this is not as well understood. And the idea for this is when you send action potentials through a synapse, and you send a lot of them through there, you will actually have a buildup of calcium ions. And what that will mean is the next time an action potential comes down, you're going to release more vesicles and more neurotransmitter the next time. That's a hypothetical mechanism of this activated long-term memory. Okay, so let's put this all together. So the human brain, like the one that all of you presumably have, and digital computers both have this need to rapidly reroute information on the basis of task demands. And it seems like we need to do that with this temporary storage buffer. In a computer, we use these CPU registers. We funnel everything through the bus into these CPU registers. In the brain, it seems as if we use the working memory system for that. This buffer is small. So other systems are going to have to store information that, like we recently encountered, might still be relevant, but isn't what we're operating on now. Usually when people are thinking about working memory, they're thinking about everything that is relevant for the task. No, it's what is being operated on at this moment, not what was, is generally relevant, but what are you operating on right now? And so we have these other systems for storing the other kinds of stuff that's relevant, like the RAM in your computer, like has loaded in a bunch of stuff that was recently used and the computer thinks it's going to be used soon. And your brain uses this activated long-term memory. Now, when new information must be processed, using your CPU registers or using your working memory, you're going to have to flush out the old stuff. There's still going to be a trace of it in your activated long-term memory, but you got to get it out of your working memory buffer. Otherwise, you can't process the next thing. But a lot of processes can happen without using that buffer, right? So on my computer, I can start up Spotify and it's playing music while I'm doing all kinds of other stuff. And the way that that is set up, actually, I don't know the way that's set up in the year 2022, but the way it was set up back when I understood how hardware worked is something called direct memory access, where the audio card could have direct access to information in RAM, bypassing the CPU. For doing something really automated, like byte after byte after byte, translate that into the intensity of the audio card output. Okay, so you can do all kinds of things that bypass the CPU, but now you've lost your flexibility. If you want to do something flexible, something you haven't done before, something that requires saying, okay, I now do this following this with this rule, now you have to use your working memory buffer. Okay, so the prediction here is that even extremely simple non-automated tasks are going to require storing the stimulus in working memory, like the A or the B in those simple tasks we did. And when you do that, it's going to displace whatever else you had in your working memory. Now, whatever else you had in your working memory, you're probably going to be able to rapidly retrieve from activated long-term memory seconds later if you need it, but it isn't in that special buffer, the working memory buffer. Okay, so that's an assertion, but I haven't shown you any evidence for this. Let's see if I can do this in about 5 minutes or so. So here's the paper, so you can read the paper. It just came out recently. And in order to explain the study, first I have to talk a little bit about our method, the event-related potential method. How many of you already kind of know about event-related potentials, ERPs? And how many of you are like, I'm a little fuzzy on the concept? Okay, well then I will do my 30-second overview of EEG and event-related potentials. You put an electrode on the skin outside of the skull, outside of the brain. Miraculously, brain activity percolates through the skull and can be measured from those electrodes on the skull. If you're just measuring that voltage over time, that's the EEG. Y-axis is amplitude in millionths of a volt. X-axis is time, and the voltage at any given electrode site is just going up and down over time. And that kind of reflects the sum of everything the brain is doing at a given moment in time. It's a very coarse signal, or complicated signal with a lot of things going on in it. Now, we can simplify it a little bit if we're presenting stimuli, like in this case, O's and X's. And we can say, okay, well, using the data following each one of these letters, let's like pull out all of the O's here and take the segment of EEG following each one of those O's, and let's see what's in common following each O. What's similar from trial to trial? Okay, so you might take out the waveform following stimulus 1, following stimulus 2, following stimulus, however many stimuli we have. And there's going to be some variation from trial to trial because the brain is doing a lot of things that are unrelated to the processing of my little O's and X's. But to the extent that the brain is doing anything consistent, there should be a consistent signal plus random variation. And if I just average many of these waveforms together, I should be able to see what's the consistent brain response. So if I average these 3 trials together along with hundreds of other trials, I will get a very reliable waveform. And so this is just showing the average across many trials that are similar of the brain's response over time. So time 0 is when the stimulus appeared. And the y-axis here is, again, voltage in microvolts. And what you'll see, I mean, this is what we would see in an electrode over the visual cortex in response to a visual stimulus. We'll see a very consistent pattern of voltage deflections. And time here is in milliseconds, and we have millisecond level resolution. In fact, we could even go below milliseconds if we wanted to. So this is unlike MRI or fMRI where you're getting like the average brain activity over a period of 6 seconds. No, when something happens in this waveform at 183 milliseconds, that means that the brain did something at 183 milliseconds. And we're actually measuring the voltages produced in the neurons from a distance, because you can measure voltages at a distance. Put a battery in the next room, run some long wires, I can measure that battery from in here, right? You're doing the same thing with electrodes on the head. The brain's your battery, voltage is going up and down, we're measuring it with our electrodes on the scalp. Okay, now what we're measuring here is not action potentials, not spikes. What we can really pick up here are the postsynaptic potentials created during neurotransmission. And it's coming from the cortical pyramidal neurons in like 99% of cases. There are some exceptions. And it's instantly transmitted to the scalp, like we're just measuring it in real time. The downside of this technique is it has poor spatial resolution. It's hard to know where in the brain it's coming from, but we do know exactly when it happened. Okay, so we can use this to see the active maintenance of information in working memory, the voltages produced by the neurons because of these recurrent feedback loops. So here's the task. It's a modified change detection task. There's a cue that tells the subject, on this trial, I want you to remember the items on the left side. They keep their eyes in the middle. They remember the eyes on the left, the colors on the left side. There's a delay. And then they just do change detection and report whether there was a change on that side. There's never a change on the other side. So on each trial, they're remembering either the items on the left or the items on the right, one side or the other. But it's random. Some trials is left, sometimes it's right. The cue tells them which side to remember. And if we do that, and we measure the voltages during this period, well, when the memory array appears, that's time 0, we get a sensory response to the memory array. But if we look out here longer on, we see working memory activity. And what we see in particular is that the voltage becomes more negative over the hemisphere that's contralateral to the side that they're storing in working memory, right? So if they're storing the items on the left, you see a negative voltage over the right. If they're storing the items on the right, you get a negative voltage over the left, because that's how the brain's organized. And so we can see the sustained difference between the contra and ipsi hemispheres as long as they're storing that information in working memory. Now, the size of that difference goes up as the number of items that they are asked to store goes up. So here they're asked to store 4, but you can vary how many items they have to store. If there's only one item on the side that they have to remember, this activity, which we call contralateral delay activity, is small, and it gets bigger and bigger up until you reach a given subject's capacity. And then it levels off, because you give them 8 items to remember, they're not remembering 8. They're remembering 3.5 items. And so it stays level after that. And this is actually beautifully sensitive to individual differences in working memory capacity. So you measure their working memory capacity behaviorally and look at what point does this level off. At some people, it levels off at 2 items. Other people, it levels off at 4 items. The point at which it levels off is strongly correlated with somebody's working memory capacity. So this is work done by my former student Ed Vogel. He left my lab, got his PhD, left my lab. 2 years later, he's publishing this in Nature. I'm like, why couldn't you have done this in my lab? And then other research by Todd and Moa using fMRI showed the same basic thing, but they could localize it to the intraparietal sulcus in the parietal lobe. Okay, so we're going to use this contralateral delay activity as a measure of working memory. And the idea is that if you're holding these 4 colored squares in working memory, actively maintaining them during this delay period, but now I present a letter during this task and ask the subject to do a task with that letter. Even if it's a very simple task, they're going to have to put that letter into working memory. And it's going to displace these colored squares from working memory. So that contralateral delay activity should disappear when I give them a single letter and a very simple task to do with that letter. Because once the stuff's in working memory, they're no longer having to do any operations on it. So that gets shoved out of working memory because now they've got a letter that they've got to do a task with. But at the end of the trial, they should still be able to do the change detection task reasonably well because of activated long-term memory. So in this initial part of the delay period, before I present that letter, they should be able to get some of that information activated in long-term memory. Okay, so the letter we used was the letter C, either reversed or not reversed. This is work done by Joanna Kreider, who is a postdoc in my lab. So you have the information that they're storing in working memory. We didn't have an arrow telling them which side to store. They just had to store the colors of the rectangles, whichever side the rectangles had to be on. Then we have this interposed stimulus, a C or an inverted C. And they just had to do something like what you had to do. They either had to press or not press. They had to press if it was this and not press if it was this. Like simplest discrimination in the world. But the idea is that in order to do this non-automated task, they need to put this symbol into working memory, and that's going to disrupt the working memory representation. So on a trial where they get this stimulus, they're initially going to store this in working memory, so we should see that contralateral delay activity. When the C or backward C gets presented, we should see a sensory response to it, and then the CDA to these lateralized stimuli should be eliminated, because now this got stored in working memory. And this is central, so it's not going to produce a lateralized response. And it shouldn't matter whether it's a go trial or a no-go trial, because either way, they had to put that into working memory in order to decide whether to go or not. But on some trials, we didn't present the interposed stimulus. And in those trials, there's nothing to disrupt the working memory representation of the colors. So they're going to retain that information using working memory. And there's good reason to believe that, yeah, it's a little bit better to have this working memory instead of activated long-term memory. Okay, so that's the complicated experiment that we ran to test this complicated idea about the nature of working memory. Oh, and the idea is that you can use your activated long-term memory to do this task at least reasonably well. Okay, so here is the behavioral performance. So this is when there wasn't any interfering stimulus presented, the K of about 2.8. The no-go trials and the go trials, okay, down. This is actually a statistically significant decline in performance, but a small decline. So they can do the task quite well. There's a little bit of interference, but they're able to do it. But are they doing the task here based on that active maintenance, working memory, or are they just using their activated long-term memory? Well, here's the contralateral delay activity. Now, what we've done here to simplify things is we've shown you here the difference between the contralateral and ipsilateral sides. Okay, so this is the activity that's really representing working memory, subtracting out all the other brain activity. And this is when we don't have that interposed stimulus. Like they're expecting it, but it just doesn't happen on some of the trials. So you get this continuous delay activity. So time zero here is the onset of the sample here. Here's the onset of the test. This black bar here indicates where that interposed stimulus would have occurred if it had occurred, but it didn't on these trials. Here's what happens when it does occur. Okay, you get a sensory response to it. And then after the sensory response is over, you can see that the contralateral delay activity has gone away. The working memory representation of these lateralized colored squares has been destroyed by doing this very simple task with this interposed stimulus. Okay, so we get initially storage in working memory, but then we get the sensory response, and then this information has to be stored in working memory, displacing the colors from working memory so that we can't see it anymore. Okay, now I should mention, if we tell the subjects to ignore this interposed stimulus, it doesn't disrupt the CDA. You get the sensory response, but it doesn't disrupt the working memory representation. So this is not some automatic thing. It's a result of having to do a non-automated task. Okay, so one conclusion is that the working memory representation of the sample stimulus is just wiped out when the subject has to perform this incredibly simple discrimination. And that leads to the conclusion that working memory is actually needed to perform this very simple cognitive operation of deciding whether that's a C or an inverted C, and then linking that up to the appropriate behavioral response. And because the behavioral performance was only slightly reduced, we're going to conclude that activated long-term memory is sufficient to perform the working memory task. Now, if I wanted to take more time, I would tell you about behavioral evidence showing that, in fact, the memory representation of the initial stimuli is actually quite a bit disrupted. It's just that this change detection task doesn't require a very good representation to do the task. Like, if you know that this item is remotely like orange, you should be able to tell that that's different from purple. And so we have a behavioral study with Gil Bay showing that, in fact, the representations become substantially less precise and more categorical if you have an interposed stimulus. Okay, but I'm not going to go into the details of that. We'll just summarize here. So here's our little rubric for the nature of cognitive science. From the psychological perspective, we have the idea that visual working memory has a very small storage capacity. It's correlated with overall cognitive ability. It's reduced in people with schizophrenia. From the computer science perspective, we can think about this computationally, that the flexible rerouting of information through a computational system really benefits from having a little storage buffer they can route everything through. From the neuroscience perspective, we can say, oh, well, how is this implemented? Well, the working memory representation is this sustained activity, and there's a lot of evidence that that synchrony, neural synchrony, is very important for that. But you also have this sort of passive storage in activated long-term memory. Okay, and then if we get back to the philosophical issues, we can say, well, there are obvious differences between the hardware of the brain and a digital computer. And yet, digital computers can be a very useful metaphor for the human mind, because it can allow us to think about what's needed for computation in a way that's not obvious when you're faced with a UC Davis college student pressing buttons in a task, and it's just harder to think about the nature of the computations there. Okay, that is the end of my presentation. I want to thank you for your attention and for the little bits of your working memory that you allocated to me during this presentation. And I'm happy to take questions. Yes.
More memory and knowledge lead to the rigidity of the mind or make it less plastic? For example, like exposure to languages, one language to many languages.
So that's a great question. So just to repeat it so that the people on Zoom can hear it. So does more knowledge have the downside of making things more rigid? Is that the essence of your question? And this is one of those things where I like to say, it's a two-word answer that begins with it and ends with depends. So sometimes by having more knowledge, you can formulate things more efficiently, and it's not going to create any problems. And in fact, there's really no evidence that learning two languages ends up being a problem for your cognitive ability. Now, there are people who say, in fact, it makes you better, although that's much more controversial. However, there is also evidence that having more knowledge can make you slower. So if you think about a memory system, and if you've got more things in it, then it's going to be slower to search for the stuff that you want. There was a paper published a few years ago about this that made a link between that and one of the most widely replicated phenomena in psychology, which is slowing of responses as you get older. So your reaction times as you go from an infant up through a teenager get faster and faster because you're getting myelinated, all this stuff is going on, you're getting more and more efficient. Then in your 20s, you kind of reach the peak of your processing speed. But from then on, there's just this sort of gradual slowing in everything you do. And man, I feel it. Like I'm in a lab meeting and my grad students and postdocs are like this, and I'm like, okay, but I know some stuff that's useful that helps me. And so there's a claim made that actually the slowing of response times in virtually all cognitive tests as you age can be explained by having more and more information stored in your memory system. So I don't know that it makes you more rigid, but it definitely has a downside. I would also say that, and more broadly, fluid intelligence, or let's just at least say fluid IQ, starts declining as well. But crystallized intelligence, how much stuff you know, keeps increasing until your brain starts to fall apart. And there's value to fluid intelligence and there's value to crystallized intelligence. Anyway, I feel like, any professor will tell you that if they give an essay exam or even like a short answer exam, that some of the students will answer by just writing down everything that they know that's remotely related to the question. They're not answering the question, it's just, here's the stuff that I know. And we call that a core dump. So I think I just did a core dump. I told you some stuff that's kind of related to the question, but I'm not sure that I answered it, but it's as close as I can get. And now I feel for the students who do a core dump when they're answering the exam questions. Okay, other questions? Yeah.
The experiment with the reverse C. You mentioned that in the end, like you didn't show a C at all, and they still use their working memory. But to match which color that changed. But mentioning that you will be showing them a C and whether or not it will be reverse or flipped. Would this have kicked back that active task to the long-term memory?
That's a great question. So if you know that there's likely to be something that you're going to have to discriminate, do you maybe use a little less working memory because you know you're going to need it for this other task? And the answer seems to be yes. That when we've done experiments that were designed properly so we could look at that, we find less sort of active maintenance initially before that stimulus is even presented, sort of in anticipation that that's going to occur. So it seems like people are reserving a little bit of working memory for that stimulus just in case they'll need it. Am I answering your question? Great. Other questions? Yes.
Working memory be improved at all?
Oh, great question. So can we improve our working memory? I just showed you evidence that working memory capacity is correlated with fluid intelligence and cognitive ability and all kinds of other stuff. Wouldn't you like to have more of that? This is a question that the United States Department of Defense would also like answered. And the reason is that in our all-volunteer army, who volunteers to go into the military? Not like you go to college and then you go into ROTC, but you graduate from high school and you go right into the military. Well, what you find is that the average IQ of military recruits is, let's just say, not as high as the military wishes it would be, because the military is now very technical. And so they would love it if there's something they could do, like give somebody some computer game that if they played it, it would increase their working memory capacity and then make them generally smarter and better able to read the manual for this device that they can use to kill people. So the Department of Defense has invested a lot of money into labs, not mine, I don't take blood money. I'm going to regret that because this is being recorded, right? So anyway, I don't do that very interesting research myself, but I know people who have. And some people claim that they can, so you can make people better at any task by giving them practice at. So we can make you better at change detection. But the question is, does it generalize to other tasks like Raven's progressive matrices or reading a schematic so that you can figure out how to fix this device that you use to kill people? And let's just say there isn't consistent evidence that you can increase people's working memory capacity in a way that generalizes. Some people believe there is. There's a lot of evidence against it. My reading of the literature is, you can find anything once or twice, but I haven't seen consistent evidence that you can make your working memory capacity better. And it's likely that if you made that one thing better, you might make something else worse. Our brains are pretty tuned. Now, some people might be better than others, but maybe they're worse at other things. And so You got to be careful when you're messing around with something like that. Other questions?
So going back to the colored cube or square exercise, right? If we have like 5 objects on there, have you noticed any common factors that relate to when we direct our attention to which 4 out of the 5 squares our visual working memory might look at?
Great question. So if I give you more items than you can remember, how does the brain decide which ones to store in working memory? Let me show you a little trick that I did, just to make you all feel good. So here's our working memory example. So notice where the change was at set size 2. Okay, now I did set size 4. Same location, changed. Because I wanted you to get set size 4 right so you'd feel good about yourselves. So I primed you. And then to make sure that not too many of you got set size 12 right, I put the change at a completely different location at set size 12. Like I'm letting you behind the curtain here and showing you all my tricks, right? So there are some things that are known about factors that impact working memory encoding. So one is priming. Another is what's called incentive salience. So if something is associated with reward or punishment or something like that, that can increase the encoding in working memory. If I direct your attention to one part of an object, you're also more likely to store the rest of that object in working memory as opposed to part of some other object. So there are a variety of things like that that are known, but there's a lot more to be done to understand that. Yes?
Do you think that perchance visual imagery during visual working memory could play a role in that, like in visual?
Man, that's such a great question. So what's the role of visual imagery here? If you have a visual image, does that help you do the task? So when I do this task, I can kind of generate a visual image or not, and it doesn't seem to help me very much, just sort of from my own phenomenological experience. And there are other people who have tried to look at this, and in general, with most tasks like this, people who report just generally having more vivid mental images don't do better than people who report lower levels of visual imagery. And in fact, oftentimes the correlation is negative. And I have a senior in my lab right now doing a thesis where he's asking this question by looking at people with what's called aphantasia. So this is a phenomenon. Don't call it a disorder. It's just like some people don't experience visual imagery. One of my postdocs is aphantasic. He tells me when he dreams, it's just black. Like he doesn't have any, and when we're trying to discuss some complicated thing, I'm trying to say, well, okay, now imagine, yeah, here's the graph, it's in my mind. He's like, I don't need that. Because his brain, like he's incredibly smart. So he's able to solve problems in ways that my brain can't. I have to rely on this like really crude visual imagery trick to do it. Anyway, so we're asking whether people who are aphantasic do any differently on these working memory tasks than people who report high levels of visual imagery. Don't have the answer yet, should have it by the end of the spring quarter. Yeah.
We're getting like the embodied cognition idea of the fact that like most of working memory could just be like through eye movements because why hold the information in your head?
Okay, so the role of sort of embodiment and eye movements is an important one. So if I ask you to remember one location in working memory, the easiest thing in the world is you just look at that location, right? Now I ask you to remember two locations. It's a lot of work to have your eyes go back and forth between two locations. Like my subjects are not going to do that. In fact, most of them won't even bother making an eye movement if it's a single object. And making an eye movement or any other kind of physical thing isn't going to help you remember colors. So we do worry about eye movements with spatial working memory. Well, I could go on a long digression that I won't, but we've sort of shown that a lot of phenomena that you get in spatial working memory studies are unchanged if you record eye position and verify that subjects are maintaining central fixation. Now, it's still the case that you can use a trick because you have covert attention. So you can just like shove your mind's eye to one location and use that to remember that location. And we have demonstrated that people will use that. But we've also shown that you can prevent people from using that trick in a way that I'm not going to describe, and people can still remember things in working memory, but there are different neural signatures. There's one neural signature that we can see if you're using your covert attention to remember a location, and another mechanism that you use when you're not using that trick. Other questions? Yes. Okay, so the question is, are there any features of like natural objects that are going to make those objects to be more likely stored in working memory? That is such a beautiful question, and a year from now, I hope to have a really good answer. What I can tell you is right now, there is not a single quantitative theory of visual working memory that can even tell you how you would store a natural image in working memory. So look at this room. There are no discrete objects in this room, right? Like it's just a continuous, like take my hand. Like, is each finger an object? Is each phalange an object? Is the whole thing an object, right? Where does it end? Like the world is not like these colored squares. And none of the theories of working memory right now can even quantify what your storage capacity is for natural scenes. Well, we've got the model and we're testing it right now. And we don't yet know about what attracts attention in those scenes, but we're on our way to being able to answer that question. Yeah.
Is there any advantage for people who are low working memory? You mentioned like you're bad at something that you want to do.
Yeah. Asking for a friend. I mean, I can tell you, I've got, your working memory capacity, like your reaction times go up and your working memory capacity goes down as you get older. And my working memory capacity ain't what it used to be. So there are multiple routes to low working memory capacity. One route, which is what seems to best explain differences among sort of typical college age people, is how good you are at keeping your attention on the relevant information for the task. So if you have low working memory capacity, it probably means that when I give you 4 items to remember, instead of remembering all 4 of those items, you remember 2 of them plus some other stuff that I didn't ask you to remember. And that could be good or bad, right? It's bad if your goal is to ace this test, but it's good if your goal is to notice that there's a spider crawling toward you, right? So it could be advantageous or disadvantageous to have a memory system that is more diffuse and distractible. A sort of classic idea there is that people with attention deficit disorder are really disadvantaged in the 21st century educational system that requires sitting there and focusing, whatever. But in sort of the natural world, like people who have a hard time sitting still and want to get up and go do stuff, like that can be a real advantage. And so you go and you find the best people in business, especially in sales. A lot of them have attention deficit, quote, disorder. It's not disorder for them. It's what allows them to succeed. So at least that route seems to be like, yeah, it's not good for some things. Might not be the ideal thing for education at UC Berkeley, but it might be the ideal thing in other situations. Let's see if there's anybody who hasn't asked one yet. Okay, I'll go back to you then.
So going back to the thing you just said, from an evolutionary point of view, like which one would be like a more favorite? Because if you want to be able to recognize multiple threads coming at you at once, I feel like that would be something that would be critical in like very olden times. With nowadays, we kind of do need to focus on process information that is, you know, more filtered. Because, well, there are no tigers that are coming toward me right now. So how does it happen?
Yeah, so the question is really, you know, what's the optimal thing to have? A large working memory capacity, and then your brain is all tied up with that stuff, or a smaller capacity and you have attention available for other things. And, you know, usually when people try to answer questions like that, they have no really way of rigorously answering it. Like, how would we know what 20,000 years ago was most optimal? And another important thing that you always need to keep in mind about evolution is that not everything that is true of contemporary humans is true because of selection, because that thing was selected for. Could be that some other thing was selected for, and this trait is sort of a side effect of that. Classic example of that is the redness of blood. Your blood is not red because it being red confers a selective advantage. It's red because it's got iron in it, and the iron in it confers a selective advantage. So it may be that we have a particular working memory capacity, not because that capacity is optimal, but because something else happened that is selected for that results in that. So I'm very leery to engage in evolutionary storytelling about why some particular thing like this is true, unless we have a way of looking at the selection pressures. In other words, I'm not going to answer your question. Okay, any more questions? Yes. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there about kind of the nature of photographic memory. So the first thing is that photographic memory does not exist. That is, memory that is truly like a photograph does not exist. And what I mean by like a photograph is like a set of pixels. Nobody has that. No documented cases of that. What some people do have is phenomenal long-term memory abilities. I don't know of anybody who has a phenomenal long-term memory ability who has been tested in a task like this. So I don't know what their working memory capacity would be like. So when you give them time to encode things in long-term memory, they do a phenomenal job. And I just don't know if anybody has ever done this sort of task in those individuals. But I can tell you that there are many cases of these individuals who have been studied who just, like, they remember everything that they've ever done and seen and heard in their lives. I shouldn't say everything. They remember an enormous amount. Just, they're usually very unhappy people. The ability to forget is very adaptive. Very adaptive. Like, I'm hoping I'll forget that comment about blood money. I hope everybody else will too. Okay, so that's another kind of non-answer, but it's useful to say we don't know when we don't know, right? Okay, other questions that I can fail to answer. Yes.
You mentioned that working memory has a set capacity. Is there a feasible way, you think, to test the capacity of long-term memory in like an experimental case setting?
Oh, yeah. How would you test the capacity of long-term memory? So there's a classic study of it by Standing in 1973, where he gave people pictures, photographs just of random, like his collection of photographs that he'd taken on his vacations, that kind of thing, right? Just all kinds of pictures. See a picture for a couple of seconds, put it down, see a picture for a couple. And then the next day they come back and he shows them pairs of pictures and they have to say, well, which one did I see yesterday and which one is new? And if they gave the subject 10 pictures to look at on day one, they're like 90% correct on day two. Give them 100 pictures on day one, they're 90% correct. Give them 1,000 pictures on day one, they're 90% correct on day two. Well, this has been around for a long time. And then, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago, a guy named Tim Brady, who was a grad student at the time, decided like, oh, there are a lot of unanswered questions about that. Like, did they really remember the details of the pictures? Or was it just, yeah, I saw a windmill yesterday, and I didn't see a can opener. So they don't remember the particular picture. They just know I didn't see a can opener. So he did a sort of new version of this where they'd see all these, now they were pictures on a computer screen. And when he tested them, sometimes it would be like, the stimulus they had originally seen was a remote control for a TV. And at test, 2 different remote controls. It's like, they really had to remember the visual details to do that. They were like 83% correct or something like that. They were, even though they had seen thousands of images. So the capacity is really high. I should note, and this isn't in the paper, it should have been, but the subjects in this study were MIT students. Like, those are not normal human beings. So there are ways of looking at that, but it's not necessarily a capacity per se. The main limit on long-term memory really seems to be interference. Like, you've got information about all kinds of things in there, but it's like things blur together and you're trying to find one thing and you find something else, sort of like you're trying to find some obscure thing using Google and you can't figure out the right search term. Like, whatever search term you put up, puts up give you a bunch of irrelevant stuff. So that seems to be more like the limitation on long-term memory as opposed to like a capacity per se. Okay, other questions? Yes.
You mentioned priming. So wouldn't that, in a sense, serve as a way of like improving working memory, at least for a very specific situation? For instance, in the case of like the letters and like A, B, C, D, like you at first while you were giving us A and B, you said don't like take care of like don't mind about it. And I knew from that the next thing you would do is give us the letters in different colors. So I mentally prepared for that. So that was priming. So I was primed for it. So why isn't the military priming people, do what they do?
Right, good question. So like when I show you this display, I'm priming you, and I can prime you for a location, whatever location changed, but I'm also now priming you for those 4 colors. But the thing about priming, and this is generally true of kind of activated long-term memory, is you get a lot of interference. So it's hard to remember what got primed on the previous trial or the trial before that or the trial before that. So if I'm asking you, okay, which one of these colors is new? Well, you got all these colors from all the previous trials now all mixed up. So it's hard to know which one is new for this trial as opposed to new relative to the trial before that or the trial before that. So what you've lost is sort of what we call episodic specificity. When you have priming, it's like, yeah, that thing is familiar, but I can't tell you if it was this trial or the trial before that or the trial before that. So it can be helpful, but there are real limits on what you can do with priming and activated long-term memory. Okay. Any, yes. Thank you. We should probably end on that note, huh?